24th of October 1944. The jungles of Bougainville, Solomon Islands. The air here doesn't just sit, it suffocates. It is a thick, wet blanket of 100% humidity that clings to the skin and rots the leather off your boots while you are still wearing them. Lieutenant Kenjiro Tanaka wipes a layer of grime from his forehead, his hand trembling slightly. It isn't fear. It has been months since he felt fear. The trembling comes from the caloric deficit gnawing at his insides. He looks down at his ration tin. It is empty. It has been empty for 2 days. Around him, the remnants of his platoon are merged with the jungle floor, their uniforms tattered, their ribs pressing sharply against their tunic buttons. They are the forgotten men of the Empire. Bypassed by the American island hopping campaign, they have been left to wither on the vine. There are no supply ships coming from Tokyo. There are no reinforcement barges slipping through the blockade at night. There is only the jungle, the malaria, and the hunger. Above the canopy, a low, thrumming vibration shakes the raindrops from the leaves. Kenjiro doesn't even look up. He knows that sound. It is the sound of a Pratt & Whitney engine. An American Corsair, or perhaps a Hellcat, patrolling the airspace with the casual arrogance of a hawk circling a dying mouse. To the Japanese soldier in 1944, the American war machine is a terrifying paradox. They were told the Americans were soft. They were told the Westerners lacked the Yamato Damashi, the warrior spirit required to endure the hardships of war. Yet, as Kenjiro digs a small root from the mud, hoping it isn't poisonous, he watches the plane bank overhead. That pilot up there isn't starving. That pilot isn't preserving his last 3 bullets for a suicide charge. That pilot likely had a hot breakfast of eggs and coffee before climbing into his cockpit. But what Lieutenant Kenjiro cannot possibly imagine what would break his mind if he could see through the clouds and across the horizon to the American anchorage is that the enemy isn't just well-fed. They aren't just bringing bombs and bullets to the Pacific. At this very moment, while Kenjiro debates eating a beetle to stay alive, the United States Navy is finalizing the manifest for a ship that defies all logic of warfare. A vessel that carries no guns, launches no planes, and transports no troops. It is a weapon of psychological destruction, fueled not by gunpowder, but by sugar, cream, and vanilla extract. The Americans are about to weaponize luxury. Washington, D.C., the Department of the Navy. 2 weeks later. 4,000 miles away from the rotting jungles of Bougainville, the air is conditioned and smells of floor wax and stale cigarette smoke. James Forrestal, the Secretary of the Navy, stares at a logistics report that would make a Roman emperor weep with envy. The United States is currently fighting a 2-ocean war. They are shipping tanks to Russia, gasoline to Britain, and millions of men to every corner of the globe. But Forrestal isn't looking at ammunition counts or fuel reserves. He is looking at a report on morale. In the U.S. Navy, alcohol is strictly prohibited aboard ships, a legacy of Josephus Daniels' General Order 99 from 1914. Unlike the British Royal Navy, where a sailor can look forward to his daily tot of rum, the American sailor is dry. Forrestal knows that you cannot ask 18-year-old boys to endure kamikaze attacks, typhoons, and the claustrophobic terror of submarine warfare without a release valve. If they can't have beer, they need something else. They need something that reminds them of the soda fountains in Brooklyn, the diners in Des Moines, and the front porches of Georgia. They need ice cream. To the Axis powers, ice cream is a frivolous luxury, something you eat at a child's birthday party, not on the front lines of a global conflict. To Forrestal, it is a strategic necessity. He famously declares to his staff, "Ice cream, in my opinion, has been the most neglected of all morale factors." But in 1944, getting frozen confection to the equator presents an engineering nightmare that rivals the Manhattan Project in its absurdity. The Pacific Theater is vast. It is millions of square miles of open ocean where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Standard refrigeration on warships is prioritized for meat and vegetables. Battleships have small ice cream machines. Sure, the Gedunk bars are popular spots, but smaller vessels, like the destroyers and submarines that do the dirty work, have no room for such equipment. A lesser nation would shrug and say, "War is hell. Eat your rations." But this is the United States of America at the absolute zenith of its industrial power. This is a nation that doesn't just solve problems, it overwhelms them with production. The solution proposed by the Navy's logistics engineers is so audacious it sounds like a joke. If the smaller ships can't make their own ice cream, and the supply lines are too long to ship it from the mainland before it melts, then the Navy will simply build a factory, put it on a boat, and tow the factory to the war. And not just any boat. Steel is in short supply. Every plate of steel is needed for carriers, destroyers, and Liberty ships. So, the engineers turn to a material that has no business floating. Concrete. At shipyards in National City, California, workers begin pouring wet cement into massive wooden forms. They are building the BRL, the barge, refrigerated, large. These are not sleek destroyers designed for speed. They are monolithic, gray slabs, 265 feet long and 48 feet wide. They look like floating apartment blocks, ugly and slow. But inside the hull of the vessel designated IX-150, soon to be christened the USS Quartz, a mechanical wonderland is being installed. General Electric and Carrier Corporation are contracted to fit the barge with a refrigeration plant massive enough to cool a small city. Workers lower massive chrome churns into the hold. They install miles of piping, colossal storage freezers, and industrial mixers. The specs are staggering. The Quartz is designed to produce 500 gallons of ice cream every single shift. It can store 2,000 tons of frozen food. It is a floating dairy plant, a temple to excess. As the shipyard workers finish the final fittings, loading sacks of sugar and crates of vanilla extract by the ton, the contrast is stark. In Japan, school children are donating their metal toys to be melted down into bullets. In Germany, citizens are mixing sawdust into their bread to make the flour last. And in California, the United States Navy is launching a concrete ship for the express purpose of ensuring that a sailor halfway around the world can have a scoop of chocolate or strawberry on a Tuesday afternoon. The Quartz is tugged out of the harbor, sitting low and heavy in the water. It has no engines of its own, it must be towed across the Pacific. It is a slow, vulnerable target. But as it begins its long journey toward the Ulithi Atoll, it carries a payload more dangerous to the Japanese worldview than high explosives. It carries the undeniable proof that the American supply chain is so brokenly overpowered that they can afford to waste resources on dessert. January 1945. Ulithi Atoll, Caroline Islands. If you want to see what winning a global war looks like, you don't go to the front lines where the bullets are flying. You go to the rear echelon. You go to Ulithi. This vast, submerged volcanic crater is the secret heart of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific. It is the largest anchorage in the world, a sprawling, temporary city floating on turquoise water. On any given day, the horizon is clogged with a staggering armada, 15 battleships, 30 aircraft carriers, hundreds of destroyers, and a boundless sea of oil tankers and supply ships. The air buzzes with the constant traffic of Kingfisher scout planes and the water churns with countless Liberty launches shuttling sailors between ships. It is hot, crowded, and despite the tropical setting, intensely industrial. The lagoon smells of bunker fuel, stack smoke, and sweating metal. Into this chaotic assembly of naval power comes a slow, ungainly procession. A fleet tug, straining against the current, hauls a massive, drab-gray rectangle into the lagoon. Aboard the destroyer USS Heermann, Seaman First Class Robert Bobby, Albright leans against the railing, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He squints at the incoming vessel. It's ugly. It sits low and squat, lacking the graceful lines of a warship or the functional curves of a Liberty cargo ship. It looks like a slab of sidewalk that learned how to float. What in the hell is that thing? Albright asks his chief. Another barracks barge? Who'd they piss off to get stationed on a concrete block? The chief petty officer takes a long drag from his cigarette and grins. He's heard the scuttlebutt from the supply officers. That, Albright, is the most important ship in this whole damn fleet. That is the USS Quartz. Albright is confused. A rock. They named a ship after a rock? Not a rock, son, the chief says, flickering ash into the lagoon. That is the concrete cow. The rumor spreads across the anchorage faster than a zero on a strafing run. By the time the Quartz drops its anchor near the supply depot, every sailor in the atoll knows what it is. The USS Quartz, designation 9150, is open for business. To step aboard the Quartz is to enter a bizarre alternate dimension. The deck is scorching hot, radiating the intense Pacific sun, but the moment you step through the heavy, insulated hatchways and down into the hold, the temperature plummets 40 degrees. It is a sensory shock. The air is frigid and dry. The smell of diesel fuel and salt spray is instantly replaced by the overwhelming, cloying aroma of vanilla and powdered milk. The sound is deafening, not the boom of 16-inch guns, but the deep, rhythmic thrumming of massive General Electric compressors and Carrier refrigeration units working at maximum capacity. The interior of this concrete hull is a gleaming stainless steel factory. It is an industrial cathedral dedicated to frozen dairy. There are no torpedo tubes here. Instead, there are massive mixing vats where sailors in clean white aprons, a stark contrast to the dungaree-clad crews of the fighting ships, dump 50-pound sacks of sugar and dehydrated milk powder into churning water. The mixture is pumped into colossal freezers that blast chill the liquid into a semi-solid state. The specs delivered to Forrestal back in Washington were not exaggerations. The quartz is a beast. It runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Every single shift, the crew churns out 500 gallons of ice cream. It comes out in thick, semi-frozen ribbons, filling 5-gallon metal canisters that are quickly capped and shoved into the cavernous storage holds. These holds are vast enough to store 2,000 tons of frozen provisions, steaks, chickens, and vegetables destined for the aircraft carriers, but the prime real estate is always reserved for the ice cream. Back up on the surface of the lagoon, a complex logistical ballet begins. It is the ice cream run. The big ships, the carriers like the Enterprise, and battleships like the Iowa have their own small Gedunk machines, but they can't keep up with the demand of 3,000 crewmen. And the small boys, the destroyers and destroyer escorts that screen the fleet, have nothing. Small boats began to cluster around the concrete flanks of the quartz like piglets, nursing on a sow. Supply officers from dozens of ships haggle and barter with the quartz's purser. The official currency is requisition forms, but the unofficial currency is far more valuable. Japanese officer swords, bottles of pre-war whiskey, or pristine souvenirs captured from the islands. A good souvenir can bump a ship up the queue or secure an extra 10 gallons of chocolate for the NCO mess. Aboard the Heermann, the arrival of the supply boat is met with more enthusiasm than mail call. When the metal canisters are hoisted onto the deck, covered in condensation, a cheer goes up that rivals the sound of shooting down a kamikaze. Down in the mess deck, Bobby Albright waits in line. It's 95 degrees in the compartment. He's tired, he's scared about the upcoming operation off Iwo Jima, and he hasn't seen his family in 18 months. He reaches the front of the line. The mess cook scoops a generous dollop into a metal bowl. It's vanilla, it's almost always vanilla, sometimes with chocolate syrup if they're lucky. It's melting fast in the heat, the edges turning into sweet white soup. Albright takes a spoonful. The cold is shocking against his teeth. The sugar hits his system like a narcotic. For 10 seconds, standing there in the sweating steel belly of a destroyer in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, he isn't at war. He's back at the drugstore counter in Dayton, Ohio. The fear recedes. The exhaustion fades. He looks at the guy next to him, who is grinning like an idiot with a white mustache of ice cream on his lip. God bless the United States Navy, Albright whispers. They finish the bowls in minutes, scraping the metal bottoms clean. They return to their duty stations re-energized, their morale artificially inflated by a staggering expenditure of national resources. They are ready to fight again because their country moved heaven and earth, and poured concrete, to bring them a taste of home. While the Americans gorge themselves on frozen sugar, a few hundred miles away on bypassed islands, Japanese garrisons are boiling leather straps to make soup. The distance between the two sides is no longer just measured in miles or firepower. It is measured in calories, comfort, and the terrifying capacity of a nation to turn luxury into a weapon of war. The 7th of April 1945. Aboard the USS Hancock, off the coast of Okinawa. The Battle of Okinawa is raging the typhoon of steel. It is the bloodiest fighting of the Pacific War. But 300 miles away, aboard the fast carriers, the war takes on a surreal, almost hallucinogenic duality. Captain Ito, a pilot of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sits slumped on a metal stool in the wardroom of the American carrier Hancock. He is soaking wet, shivering, and wrapped in a rough gray wool blanket. 2 hours ago, his Zero was clipped by anti-aircraft fire. He had bailed out, expecting to drown or to pull the pin on his grenade before capture. Instead, an American destroyer plucked him from the waves and transferred him here. He waits for the torture. He waits for the interrogation. He waits for the confirmation of everything the propaganda officers in Tokyo told him, that the Americans are barbarians, monsters who will carve him up for sport. Instead, a young American mess attendant walks up to him. The boy looks barely old enough to shave. He is holding a small paper cup. He says something in English that Ito doesn't understand, and places the cup in Ito's trembling hands. Ito looks down. It is a scoop of vanilla ice cream. It is perfectly frozen. It is smooth. It is not melting, despite the humidity of the ship. Ito stares at the white mound. His mind tries to process the logistics required for this object to exist. He knows the state of his own navy. He knows that the Yamato, the pride of the fleet, is sailing on a one-way suicide mission with only enough fuel to reach Okinawa because the Empire has run dry. He knows that his fellow pilots are flying planes held together with baling wire, fueled by pine root oil. And here, in the middle of the ocean, the Americans are making ice cream. He takes a bite. The sweetness is shocking, but the temperature is what destroys him. To produce ice cream, you need excess. You need excess sugar, which Japan does not have. You need excess dairy, which Japan does not have. But mostly, you need energy. You need massive generators, redundant refrigeration systems, and a supply chain so unbroken, so arrogant in its abundance, that it can afford to burn fuel just to keep a dessert cold. In that small paper cup, Captain Ito sees the end of the war. He realizes that Japan never stood a chance. They are not fighting an army, they are fighting an industrial avalanche. They are fighting a nation that treats the Pacific Ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway for its own convenience. This was the true lethality of the USS Quartz and her sister barges. They were not combat vessels, but they were perhaps the most effective psychological weapons in the U.S. arsenal. Reports from interrogated prisoners throughout 1945 began to show a pattern. Japanese soldiers who raided American dugouts hoping for ammunition or maps would instead find discarded wrappers, tins of Spam, and sometimes, if they were close enough to the beachhead, empty ice cream cartons. A captured diary from a Japanese officer on Bougainville noted his despair after observing an American supply drop. I realized the war was lost when I saw that the enemy was supplied not only with ammunition but with luxuries we have not seen in years. They fight with the comfort of home at their backs, while we fight with nothing but our spirit. Spirit cannot defeat steel and sugar. By the summer of 1945, the concrete cows were producing nearly unimaginable quantities of morale. The U.S. Navy was supplying over 65 million gallons of ice cream annually to its troops. It became the symbol of American dominance. It sent a message to every sailor in the fleet: your country can do anything. We can move mountains, we can build islands. And we can bring you the corner store, no matter how far you sail. When the surrender documents were finally signed on the deck of the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, the guns fell silent. The concrete barges, their mission complete, were largely forgotten. The USS Quartz was eventually sold off, her massive freezers dismantled, her history as a morale factory fading into obscurity. But for the men who served both the Americans who cheered her arrival and the Japanese who despaired at her existence, the lesson was clear. World War II was won by brave men and brilliant strategies, yes. But it was also won by the sheer, crushing weight of American industry, a force so powerful that it could dedicate an entire ship, made of concrete, just to making sure the boys had dessert.